On paper, the price looked like a market outcome. A new 31-foot sailboat, the smallest Catalina built before the company went bankrupt in January 2026, carried a factory base price of $163,000. The industry called that a reflection of modern production costs, elevated materials, sophisticated engineering, and consumer expectations that had evolved since the 1970s. Every one of those explanations is true in the narrow sense. None of them is the actual cause. A 1978 Catalina 27 sold new for roughly $12,000. Adjusted for every dollar of inflation between 1978 and today, that boat should cost $53,000 on a current dealer lot. The smallest equivalent Catalina built before bankruptcy cost $163,000. That $110,000 gap is not consumer preference at work. It is the measurable result of a Senate vote, a liability structure that was never reformed, a Supreme Court ruling that expanded manufacturer exposure in 2019, and a private equity acquisition that turned your slip into a yield-generating asset in 2025. Those are the causes. This video names every one of them and shows the math. What part of the $163,000 price tag do you think is actually the boat, and what part is the system around it? Leave that in the comments and subscribe to Yachts and Boats for the kind of analysis the industry will not compile for you. In 1978, a factory worker who built boats for a living in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, could buy the boat he built on a single year's salary. In 1978, the median U.S. household income was approximately $16,500. A new Catalina 27 cost $12,000. That is 73 cents on every dollar of median annual household income. The same arithmetic applied across the Pearson 30 lineup, the Ericsson 35 program, the Cal 40 series. Ordinary Americans were the customer. The manufacturers were building for them on purpose. Frank Butler founded Catalina Yachts in 1969 with a specific goal: well-made sailboats that ordinary Americans could afford to buy. By the time Catalina went bankrupt on January 6, 2026, after 56 years of continuous production and 85,000 boats built, the smallest boat in its lineup started at $163,000. That is 194% of the median household income in 2024, which was $83,730. The boat did not get nearly 4 times more expensive because fiberglass got 4 times more expensive. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Boat Building Producer Price Index reached 400.29 in September 2025. That index was set at 100 in December 1984. Boat building costs rose roughly 4 times over that period, while general consumer inflation rose roughly 3 times. The extra multiplier, the one the industry does not discuss, comes from a specific sequence of decisions made between 1986 and 2025. The sequence starts with a vote. October 1990. Congress passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Buried inside it was a 10% luxury surcharge on boats sold for more than $100,000. The stated purpose was to make the wealthy pay their fair share. Rich buyers would simply pay the premium and sail away. The Joint Committee on Taxation projected it would raise $31 million in its first year. It raised $16.6 million. The rich did what the rich do when a discretionary purchase becomes more expensive. They waited, or they bought abroad, or they decided a second home in the mountains was a better use of the capital. The people who could not wait were the workers in the boatyards. In the same first year, sales of boats priced over $100,000 dropped by 77%. Total U.S. boat sales fell from $17 billion in 1989 to $10 billion by 1992. That is a 41% collapse across the entire industry in 3 years. Brunswick Corporation, the parent of brands including Sea Ray and Bayliner, closed 5 plants and laid off nearly 1,000 employees in 1990 alone. Pearson Yachts in Portsmouth, Rhode Island went from 220 workers to 50. The large boat division filed for bankruptcy. The workers still on the payroll were building small sailboats to keep the lights on. Catalina cut production of the Catalina 42, then priced at just over $100,000, from 4 boats per week to 1. 200 workers were laid off. Viking Yachts, the largest yacht manufacturer in the United States at the time, laid off 81% of its 1,400-person workforce within 8 months of the tax taking effect. By the time Congress repealed the luxury tax in August 1993, Viking was down to 68 employees. Harrison Yacht Sales on Maryland's Eastern Shore went from 95 people to 8 by June 1991. The Baltimore Sun documented the collapse in detail. Egg Harbor Yacht, one of the oldest boatyards in South Jersey, filed for bankruptcy and dismissed all 250 workers. Senator John Chafee of Rhode Island stood in the Senate Finance Committee chamber and said it plainly. The luxury tax did not get the rich, it got those who build the boats. The Joint Economic Committee confirmed the calculation. Value of jobs lost in the first 6 months alone, $159.6 million against a full-year revenue yield of $16.6 million. Net fiscal impact on the federal government in 1991, negative $7.6 million. Collecting the tax cost more than not having it. Congress repealed it in August 1993. By then, the manufacturing base was already gone in a way that a repeal could not undo. Workers had scattered, tooling had been sold or scrapped, supply chains had collapsed. A company that survived on 30 workers cannot rebuild to 200 workers the moment a law changes. The institutional knowledge, the trained yard workers, the established dealer networks, those take years to build and weeks to lose. Smaller yards that had survived on premium orders filed for bankruptcy while waiting for Washington to act. The companies that came back smaller, building fewer boats at higher prices for a narrower customer. Before the luxury tax, the United States boating industry ran a trade surplus of $600 million. By 1997, the balance had turned to a deficit of $145 million. By 2020, it was a deficit of $1.4 billion. By 2022, marine imports reached $5 billion against exports of $2.5 billion. The first year in recorded industry history where the trade deficit exceeded every dollar of national marine exports. That trade balance is where the next layer of the price starts. The manufacturers who filled the vacuum that United States policy had created were European. Beneteau, based in La Rochelle, France, had never faced the American luxury tax. Jeannot, owned by the Beneteau Group, now assembles boats in Marion, South Carolina, using the same facility Beneteau shares. Together with Hans and Fontaine Pajot, Beneteau Group now holds approximately 29% of the global sailboat market. By 2023, the United States was importing $5.1 billion in recreational boats and exporting $2.6 billion. That deficit of $2.5 billion is the trade footprint of a domestic manufacturing collapse that started with a Senate vote. A new Beneteau Oceanis 30.1, 30 feet, 2 cabins, diesel inboard, the entry-level production cruiser, lists on United States dealer sites between $154,900 and $199,000. The average across active 2026 listings is approximately $170,000. That price exists because European builders scaled into a market the United States government had cleared. These builders are not price gouging. Beneteau and Jeannot are selling into a market with no domestic competition at the entry level, against a liability architecture that made United States production at that price point structurally unprofitable. That is the second layer. American product liability law in the 1970s and 1980s created an exposure with no statute of limitations for manufacturers. A boat built in 1972 could still generate a lawsuit in 1992 and in 2002 and beyond. Defense costs were owed from the moment a case was filed, whether the manufacturer won or not. The risk was not theoretical. It was a recurring line item that showed up on every production boat manufacturer's balance sheet regardless of their safety record. The aviation parallel was documented precisely in testimony before Congress. Cessna said in the mid-1980s that it was spending more defending liability cases than it earned in profit on cases it was winning. In 2001, a jury awarded $480 million against Cessna for a 1989 crash involving a plane built in 1965. Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act in 1994, capping liability exposure for aircraft manufacturers at 18 years. Production of small aircraft resumed. Prices reset at a higher floor, but the industry survived. Marine manufacturers received no equivalent reform. The 2019 Supreme Court ruling expanded the exposure further. Manufacturers can now be sued for products modified by third parties if the manufacturer knew those modifications were likely. The ruling landed at the moment the industry was least equipped to absorb it, with its domestic manufacturing base already hollowed out and with no pricing headroom remaining at the lower end of the market. Structurally, nothing changed. Building costs above the regulatory floor rose, liability exposure rose, and the price point that had made production sailboats accessible to a factory supervisor or a public school teacher quietly disappeared from dealer catalogs. Every manufacturer who survived moved UP market. Boats got more expensive not because fiberglass or diesel engines increased disproportionately, but because the legal overhead of production at the accessible price point made that price point unprofitable. Industry communications present the upmarket migration as consumer preference. On a liability spreadsheet, it is arithmetic. Which part of this sequence hit you harder, the 1990 vote that destroyed the workforce, or the liability structure that has never been fixed? Drop that in the comments. But here is what the industry calls the product of all this. Not a manufacturing collapse, not a liability failure, not a 40-year sequence of institutional decisions. They call it a participation problem. The median age of US boat owners reached 60 years old at the end of 2024. There are now more registered boat owners in their 70s than in their 40s. Jack Ellis, managing director of Infilink Technologies, published a single sentence that captures what that means. Many of the people who owned boats 25 years ago are the same people who own boats today. They are just 25 years older. A replacement pipeline of sailors never formed. The industry calls this a participation problem and frames it as a marketing challenge. A Senate vote in 1990 began dismantling the affordable production sailboat. A liability structure that was never reformed continued the work. A 2019 Supreme Court ruling expanded manufacturer exposure at the moment the industry could least absorb it. An insurer named Pantaenius USA, one of the largest marine insurers in the country, stopped writing new policies entirely in 2024, reducing competition in a market where the remaining insurers already faced fewer constraints. And then, in February 2025, Blackstone Infrastructure acquired Safe Harbor Marinas from Sun Communities for $5.65 billion. The same network of 138 marinas that Sun Communities had bought for $2.1 billion in 2020. Blackstone's senior managing director, Heidi Boyd, described the acquisition rationale in the press release. Marinas benefit from key long-term thematic tailwinds, including the growth of travel and leisure, as well as population inflows into coastal cities. Thematic tailwinds. Blackstone Infrastructure is the same entity that owns QTS, the largest data center provider in the United States. It owns AirTrunk, the largest data center platform in the Asia-Pacific region. It owns Carix, the largest marine terminal operator in North America. It now also owns the slip where your boat is kept. The deal was valued at approximately 21 times earnings. That multiple tells you precisely what Blackstone expects to do with pricing over the holding period. In 2024, 84% of US marinas reported rising costs. 70% raised slip fees that year. 60% raised service rates. A 25-foot boat in a mid-range coastal marina now costs between $6,000 and $12,000 per year for the slip alone, before fuel, maintenance, haul-out, or insurance. A 40-foot boat in a premium coastal market runs between $25,000 and $40,000 per year in marina costs before a single repair. When you add insurance at 3% of insured value, annual maintenance at the marine industry standard of 12.5% of vessel value, and the recurring haul-out and bottom paint cycle, a $60,000 used cruising sailboat carries a recurring annual floor of $21,300 before a single unexpected failure. Boatwork.co published a 2026 analysis of 40-foot monohull ownership costs and arrived at $55 to $90 per day before leaving the dock. That is $20,000 to $33,000 per year on a boat sitting in its slip. These costs are not new. The industry presents them as the ordinary cost of ownership. They are the ordinary cost of a market that has been progressively restructured to extract from owners who are already committed. That restructuring now has a new layer on top. Starting in April 2025, boats imported from the European Union entered the United States subject to a 15% tariff, up from the prior rate of 1% to 2%. A Beneteau Oceanus 30.1, already listed at $170,000, carries approximately $25,500 in additional tariff cost on future shipments above that previous baseline. Fiberglass cloth, most of which comes from China, faces tariffs that BoatTest.com calculated at potentially 69% more expensive for the builder. Bilge pumps and hardware from Chinese suppliers face 30% additional cost. Garmin navigation electronics from Taiwan face an additional 32%. Simrad from Mexico faces an additional 10%. The boats getting more expensive are the imports. The domestic alternative that would absorb that demand went bankrupt in January 2026. The tariff arrived 35 years too late to protect the industry it was designed to protect. The sailor who wanted an affordable American-made sailboat in 2026 gets the worst of both positions, no domestic option, and a price premium on the European import that replaced it. Across the 40 years this sequence ran, including the 1990 vote, the unreformed liability structure, the 2019 Supreme Court ruling, the 2024 insurer exit, and the 2025 Blackstone acquisition, the industry compiled these as separate events with separate causes. They are not separate. Each one built on the structural damage the previous one left behind. The $163,000. Catalina 315 is the final entry on the ledger. The ledger does not lie. The exit from that ledger exists. It has existed since 1990, when the first sailors understood what was coming and acted accordingly. In 2024, pre-owned boats represented 78.3% of all U.S. boat transactions. 858,798 used boats changed hands, compared with 238,117 new ones. The 2024 global average used boat price was $211,500. The 2024 global average new boat price was $174,000. Used boats cost more than new ones on average now because the new boat inventory has compressed towards smaller and cheaper models, while the used supply includes larger vessels built when American manufacturers were still competing on quality at accessible prices. A 1979 Catalina 30 trades today between $12,000 and $35,000 depending on condition. A 1982 Pearson 323 is in the same range. A 1984 Ericsson 35 trades between $12,000 and $35,000. These boats were designed and built during the era when American yards were competing on quality at prices a middle-class family could reach. The fiberglass in a 1980 Catalina 30 is not inferior to the fiberglass in a 2015 production boat. The hull form is proven. The design has 30 years of offshore passages behind it. Buying a 1983 hull for $18,000 instead of a base spec new equivalent at $163,000 is not settling. It is access to the same water for 1/9 the price. For the sailor who wants to understand which costs in the system are genuinely mandatory and which are mandatory only because an institutional actor in the chain treats their requirement as law. The architecture maps clearly. Marine insurance is not required by law in any U.S. state. No statute mandates that a recreational sailor carry insurance on a privately owned vessel. The requirement comes from marina contracts and lenders. A sailor who owns their boat outright and keeps it on a mooring or at anchor faces no legal mandate from any insurer. The annual marine survey that insurers require as a condition of coverage disappears without the insurer. The mandatory haul-out schedule that follows from the survey requirement goes with it. Safe Harbor's 138 marinas represent a fraction of the available anchorages, moorings, and smaller independent marinas that have not yet been acquired. A sailor willing to anchor out eliminates the slip fee entirely in most U.S. coastal jurisdictions. The sailors who understood this architecture 30 years ago are the ones who bought a Pearson 30 for $12,000, put it on a mooring for $200 a month, carried a self-insurance reserve of $15,000 in a savings account, and sailed it for 15 years without a policy. Run that arithmetic forward. 15 years at $1,800 per year in premiums is $27,000 paid to an insurer. Against a $15,000 reserve, the sailor controls, earns interest on, and retrieves in full if nothing goes wrong. The sailor who holds the reserve keeps the $12,000 difference at the end of 15 years. The insurer who collected premiums over 15 years of uneventful sailing produced nothing in return for the premium paid. There is no product, there is no repair, there is no claim settlement. There is a wire transfer from the sailor's account to the insurer's account every year for 15 years against a risk that never materialized and a reserve the sailor could have kept the entire time. This is not a position on the fringe of financial planning. It is arithmetic. 40 years of specific decisions by named actors, including a Senate committee, the United States Supreme Court, Pantaenius USA's underwriting department, and Blackstone Infrastructure's acquisition team, produced a sailboat market where new production at an accessible price no longer exists in America. Market forces did not produce this outcome. Consumer tastes did not produce it either. The affordable production sailboat was not left behind by history. It was removed from the market by a specific sequence, and the sequence is documented in the public record. The industry will not compile it for you. The sailor who understands the full architecture of that system is the only sailor positioned to pay 1/9 the price for access to the same ocean. Subscribe to Yachts and Boats. The next video maps which specific costs in the ownership chain are legally required and which are only presented as required. The gap between those two categories is where most of the money goes.